Our next conversation, I'm going to let Sunanna do most of the talking to introduce again Dr. Dintersmith, but I wanted to tell you just a little bit about Sunanna. She's a fabulous young educator and leader, and she's right now directing Remake Learning, which brings together 500 organizations in southwestern PA and northern West Virginia. And the WVPEC, PAC as Jim calls it, we have partnered with Sunanna and Remake Learning. Gail and I both serve on the board, and we did the champion. We have Maggie McDonald with us here today, who was a champion of Remake Learning and traveled all over the state in May to see some of the good things going. And it's kind of, I like to call it a viral movement, but it's much more than that. And she is going to facilitate a conversation with Ted Dintersmith. And as we're kind of transitioning and getting this group mic'd up, we have a wonderful video that Dr. Dintersmith has shared with us.
And a West Virginia angle on this, so Kim and JT, who produced this, are here. And JT's family is from West Virginia, so there you go.
All right. That part with the robot at the end, yeah. That part with the robot at the end really gets me. That video is, it's just so fluid, the movement. It's amazing. So thank you, Donna, for that kind introduction. I'll do a really quick introduction of Ted. You can also find his bio right here in the program as well. Ted, it's important to know, was a businessman for a long time, a former venture capitalist, so understands business and entrepreneurship really well. In 2012, President Obama appointed him as a representative in the United Nations General Assembly. Ted Dintersmith also produced a video you might have seen called Most Likely to Succeed, which appeared in many film festivals across the country, and also wrote a book with Tony Wagner called Most Likely to Succeed about the future of schooling and why it's so important in our country. Most recently, and if you've read even parts of the book, you'll know that Ted went to every single state, 50 states in our country, traveled to over 200 schools to really see, you know, what does learning look like in these schools and how are these schools preparing students for the future. And so we're going to learn more about that today, and I thought the best place to start.
I just want to deny something. I was introduced last night as an Ivy League graduate, and I deny it. And not only that, when I went to high school, I had no idea what the Ivy League was. And so, so definitely don't put me in that category.
Well, speaking of, I mean, you know, going back to your high school and also going back in the beginning, I'd like to go back to the beginning of your book, actually, which is a great, if any of you were able to, there are copies outside. You should definitely pick one up. But this is how Ted Dintersmith starts his book, and I just want you to respond to it for me, if you would. He says, quote, "A few years ago, I connected some dots. Machine intelligence is racing ahead, wiping out millions of routine jobs as it reshapes the competencies needed to thrive. Our education system is stuck in time, training students for a world that no longer exists. Absent profound change in our schools, adults will keep piling up on life's sidelines, jeopardizing the survival of civil society." Can you talk a little bit, Ted, about what brought you to that sense of urgency that we can see in that beginning?
Yeah, I mean, I spent my career in venture capital. So I had a ringside seat, top-tier venture firm. Don't blame us, but we were first-round investors in Twitter. And so we were seeing great entrepreneurs. We were doing these things, and I just kind of over a period of time realized that innovation is a two-edged sword. And while it makes us all dramatically more productive at communications, are easy globally, you know, all sorts of great things, it was going right at the core of what a lot of people do for a living. And we have some very misleading economic numbers. You know, everybody says the economy's thriving. The reality is most people are barely getting by. And they're piecing it together with a lot of jobs that will be there for a few more years and then disappear. And so that was the first thing. And then you just sort of looked at schools. I said this last night. you will get on the honor roll in almost every school in America, K through 16, if you can memorize material, replicate low-level procedures, and follow instructions, which is exactly what machine intelligence does perfectly. And in the process of pushing kids, and I found in venture, back to my Ivy League theme, the reason I did so well in venture is I figured out pretty quickly that the academic superstars were the wrong people to back. And they were motivated, they were competitive, they wanted to do well, but I ended up calling them the go fetch a dog biscuit kids. Tell me what I've got to do to get the business equivalent of an A. And when I talk to employers today, that's what they say. They say, I think somewhat without realizing the irony, most businesses say, we're going to use a college degree as a screening criteria. We won't even interview somebody without a college degree, which is, I think, causing them to miss a lot of great potential employees. But then at the same time, they say, colleges are doing a terrible job of preparing kids for professional life. And yet you see things that are encouraging, like Google went back and looked to see whether college pedigree mattered, concluded it didn't, and most of the groups are hiring a lot of kids who are either high school dropouts or high school only grads. I think that's an encouraging development.
Well, I think, last night Dr. Gee talked about, and you can see it in this other publication that was out front, that something like 20% of West Virginians have a bachelor's degree or higher, right, in the state. And it really made me think about, again, another piece of your book where you talked about, in fact, you say pretty directly, college ready impedes learning and innovation in our schools. So we have a lot of conversations about college ready and what that means, and about, just the panel before us had a lot of conversation about college. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Well, the first thing, I'd encourage you to do this. If you go online and you look at what kids study, particularly middle and high school, let's just take the curriculum in grades 7 through 12. I always encourage people, look at what you studied back then and ask yourself how much of it you actually use as an adult. That number is not 90%, it's not 95%, it's not 99%. It's 20% or lower.
Yeah.
And it's all there because it rolls into things like the SAT or the college application. And so when you look at that and you say, wait a minute, what if this march toward ever increasing college readiness is actually doing very little to prepare kids for life and making them, and I see this over and over again, it makes them risk averse. When I go to most high schools, about the only question kids ask is, will this be on the test? Yep. So it's stifling curiosity. And I told the story last night, for those who weren't here last night, about watch the movie Science Fair, it's on iTunes, and look at West Virginia's kid in the film, a guy named Robbie, who's incredible at machine intelligence and artificial intelligence, qualifies and goes to the Intel Global Science Fair competition, hated school, got bad grades, applied to 12 colleges, got into none. He's your future, and he left West Virginia to go join a startup in Silicon Valley. That's not what you want to have happen with your best and brightest.
Well, here's my, I get this question all the time in Pittsburgh, and I was really interested to hear your answer. I have quite a snarky answer to this question, but I'm interested to hear your answer. What we hear all the time, as a combat, this would seem to go to the logical conclusion that school needs to change. Our classrooms look the same as they've looked for 100 years. There needs to be something fundamentally different in particularly our high schools, but our entire, K through 12 experience. What people say often to me is, well, Sunanna, school worked for me. I'm a problem solver. I went to school. I'm an expert. You say that in your book too, which I think is interesting. I went to school. I know about education. It worked for me. And so, it's still going to work for my kids and for future generations. What is your response to that?
Yeah,
I'm sure you've heard that
so
too.
2 or 3 things. One, I got out of school. I got out of high school in 1970, so 66 years old. The economy then was defined by lots of routine jobs. Blue-collar routine jobs where you just do the routine things over and over, but also a lot of white-collar routine jobs.
Yep.
I mean, visualize AT&T with labor grades and job descriptions and do something for 2 to 3 years and prove you can do it, and then you jump to the next labor grade, or in the school equivalent, the next school grade. And so the focus, the organizing principle of school was a perfect preparation for what was going on in the workplace. Those jobs used to be almost 100% of our economy. I mean, an AT&T might have a few innovative people, but it was 100,000, several 100,000 people just doing routine stuff. Well, those routine jobs are disappearing, and they're disappearing fast. And that video shows you, I mean, all those things are going to be real by the time kids in kindergarten are out of school. And so what was great, things are in place for a reason. There's a lot of reason the curriculum was in place back before we had a supercomputer in our pocket. There's a lot of reason the structure made sense at a time. But those times are in the rearview mirror. And what I really worry about is if kids come out of school with skills that are largely irrelevant and with mindsets that have largely been impaired and damaged them in a world of innovation and creativity,
Yeah.
those kids, and you have 300,000 kids in West Virginia in K through 12 right now, those kids are in for a world of hurt. And
Yeah.
so they're counting on the people in this room to make great decisions. I think we owe them that.
You know, I'm based in Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Mellon is one of the biggest institutions. And when you think about Carnegie Mellon, you think about robotics and innovation and kind of the cutting edge. Professors tell me all the time, Sunanna, we are having to, and we talked about this last night, remediate students in how to problem solve. Because students come in and they're saying, you know, just tell me what I need to do to get an A on this test. Tell me what I need to do to pass this next project. And they're unable to do the complex problem solving across multiple subjects that's required at Carnegie Mellon. And so I think you're going to show the video from MIT.
Here we go.
But it kind of points directly to your point that this kind of training that we get in pre-K through 12 right now leads to a lack of ability to do that kind of complex problem.
So I'm a big fan. If you read what I write, if you listen to what I say, I'm a huge fan of CTE. My vintage was vocational education. And I think we believe that the kids are on the academic path are learning at a higher level. They're learning really important things. And oftentimes we view CTE as sort of that, an alternative path for the kids who can't cut it academically. So I want you to watch this video. And we didn't produce it, but I love it. So the reason I love this video is I want you to think about the academic performance of the kids we just saw. You know they got 5s on AP Physics, 5s on AP Calculus BC, 800s on their SAT, one of the 8 or 9% to get into MIT that year, 4.5 or higher high school grade point adjusted GPAs, or honors adjusted GPAs. And yet, after 4 years at MIT, the most prestigious engineering institution in the world, they can't light up a light bulb. And it was done by a long-term professor at MIT who is skeptical that students at MIT are learning any real science and engineering. And so one of the things that actually I argue for is if kids in high school were studying electricity, in part by shadowing a master electrician, they'd actually understand electricity. Instead of memorizing Coulomb's law and Kirchhoff's law, they'd actually understand it. They'd respect a profession that we absolutely should be respecting because, by the way, being a master electrician requires science, technology, entrepreneurship, real competence. But I also think those kids would be better prepared to be engineering majors at a college. And so why isn't that part of school? Why did we drop shop? The one thing that we did that was hands-on when I went to school has been dropped. It's because it's taking time from college ready and because those types of things are hard to test. And so one of the lines I say in my book is we have kids study what's easy to test, not what's important to learn. And it's a lot easier to test Coulomb's law in an AP physics exam than it is to give kids a light bulb wire and a battery and say, light up the light bulb. And that drives so much of what's going on in our schools today.
So this is going into just so you know, in the middle of your program, actually at the Staple, there's a publication that we just produced called Still Hiring Humans, and it's about this future of work and kind of how that comes together with the future of learning. And on the second page, there's a quote from The Onion, which, as you know, is a satirical news source. But it says, from a future labor secretary, quote, if you're able 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to be able to repeat an extremely precise sequence of movements up to 150 million times without pause, there's work for you in this new economy. And when I read that, I thought, oh my goodness, that reminds me of standardized testing. As a former teacher in 1st and 2nd grade who my principal was telling me to spend time teaching my 1st graders how to fill out bubble tests, right? That was the priority. So when we think, and that is a precise sequence of tasks, which students are doing hundreds of times, filling out bubble tests, right? And I think about how that's just not going to prepare them for the actual new economy. So tell us a little bit about assessment, right? Where is the cognitive dissonance in your mind between these skills that we know the economy needs and yet how we're set up in our systems of accountability across the country?
Yeah, a lot, if you read me, you know I am a ferocious advocate for our teaching profession. And I feel like we often take the ills of school and blame teachers for it without stepping back and saying, what conditions, what objectives, what measures of success do we impose on our schools, do we impose on our teachers? Because teachers are like anybody else in life. If you're judged and evaluated on certain metrics, you really don't have as many choices about what you do in the classroom. You're going to do the things that prepare kids for those metrics. And so when it is how many of your kids get into college, when it is how many did well on state-mandated standardized tests, that drives the culture of school. And when I travel and when I talk to teachers, they know how damaging that is. But they're not getting a lot of support from anybody else that says if we want to prepare kids for a different world, we need a different world of assessments. So I'm going to put this audience to a challenge. I'm going to take a question that's on your 8th grade math, West Virginia Standards of Assessment test. So this is something 8th graders are being tested on and teachers are being held accountable to. 8th grade students. I'm going to say the problem, and if you are confident you can answer it in 30 seconds, raise your hand. It will give you 30 seconds and let you respond. Okay? So the fraction 1/6 raised to the p power, p, equals 36 cubed times 6 to the 18th power. Who can get this in 30 seconds? Bit of time pressure. Audience waiting. Anybody? Anybody? Okay, what is it? Yeah, what? Think I'm going to just say, oh, he can get it and it's fine? What is it? Sure. 1/6 to the p power equals 36 cubed times 6 to the 18th power. No. Okay, so we'll talk about that afterwards. You know, the second question, this is the more important question, is how many of you use something like that in your adult life? How many of you are dealing with equations with exponents like 18 in your adult life? And so how many of you are legislators? Could you hold up your hand if you're a legislator? I would love you guys. I mean, this is a great group. I am so impressed. I'm here. You're here. You can do amazing things. I'm going to beg a few of you to take some of these state-mandated tests that the kids have to take and the teachers are held accountable to and share with each other and maybe with this great organization here what you learn from it. Because when you're holding, you know, every minute of time kids spend drilling for something they're never going to use as an adult takes time from doing something that's really important. And so when you look at that, and I can tell you, so this will sound braggy, so bear with me, but you know, I was an undergraduate, majored in physics and English. I'm going to come back to English maybe later, which was far more important than the science, the STEM I took. I have a PhD in applied math from Stanford, ran a math-intensive chip company for 6 years, and then backed algorithm-intensive startup companies for 20 years. Okay, so that's pretty STEMmy, that's pretty mathy, right? And I can tell you that almost none of grade 9 through 12 math is anything any of the people I worked with ever used. And so you have to say, what's the point? And I'll tell you what is happening with that is the kids that can't do 1/6 to the p power equals 36 cubed times 6 to the 18th power quickly start to think they're not smart. The teachers that can't get their kids to do that under time pressure on a standardized test are going to be held accountable to it. So when your questions on your state-mandated test, and the same would be said, the only thing that prepares a kid for is the SAT or the ACT. Because they love those kinds of questions. They absolutely, I promise you, if you read what Most Likely to Succeed, the book I wrote with Tony Wagner, when you're designing these standardized tests, you want to produce a bell curve of distributed results. And you want a lot of objective questions that have a definitive right answer. You do not want anything creative in those tests. The best advice an SAT or an ACT tutor can give to a kid is they say, if you come across a hard problem you're going to have to work to figure out, skip it. I mean, think about the life lesson from telling kids if it's hard and you're going to have to work to figure it out, skip it. And the second best thing they can tell you to do is drill endlessly to do something your phone can do so you get those questions done in 15 seconds and get it right. And so when you hold kids and you hold schools accountable to that, you need to step back and say, if I get good at this, is that going to help me later in life? And I think the definitive answer is not.
There's an educator in the Remake Learning Network who told me once, you know, who had a student come up and cry to them during a standardized test and say, you have taught me to use all the tools at my disposal to figure out problems. That, you know, I have smartphones, I have digital technologies, I have the internet, I have all of these tools around me that are at my fingertips at this point, and yet I can't use any of them right now. And it was a really disheartening situation and made her feel not smart when really she had all the tools available and was able to use them, which is such a key skill for this new economy. But let's say you have legislators in this room right now who say, okay, I get it, I'm on board, we should change assessments. What does that look like? You know, in this new project-based type of world, if people are bought in, do assessments go away? Do they change? What do you think?
They definitely don't go away. I mean, and I never find a teacher who says, I'm not comfortable, let me say this the right way. They don't say, I don't want to be held accountable. They say, I'm fine being held accountable to something that matters. Okay, so I want to underscore that. Teachers are not out there saying, don't hold me accountable, let my kids play freeze tag. These teachers, they care desperately about the future of their kids. But we generally drive policies in education. This is a national thing, it's a state thing in most states. We drive those policies without giving teachers a voice at what's going on in the classroom, with what they're being held accountable to. And it's very difficult, when you give lots of people marching orders they had no say in and they don't believe in, you're not empowering great work to take place in our schools. And so I write about an incredible transformation that happened over an 8-year period in New Hampshire, where they went from same old to entirely competency-based and performance-based. And if you're all getting copies of the book, I'll spare you the details, but it's 3-4 concise pages that lay out what they did. It's informed evaluations based on tangible evidence of student work, subject to checks and balances with audits. And I'll tell you one thing that's anecdotal but telling is I've probably done 200 forums, maybe more, in the last 4 years. The best questions I've ever gotten, and when we get to questions here, you're up against this standard, the best questions I've ever gotten when I did forums with high school students in New Hampshire. They were being taught how to think, how to ask great questions, how to critically analyze. And so they did it. It can be done at the state level. I do a lot in North Dakota, where the legislators are incredibly focused on what we can do to empower great learning in our classrooms. And so it does require stepping back and saying, if we want to reimagine education, we have got to reimagine assessments and accountability. Because if you keep the same old assessments and ask everybody to do better things, they're going to have that constant trade-off of having kids. I told last night, go visit, here, I'm asking for some volunteers. I need some people here to go visit Dunbar Intermediate School in Dunbar, just outside of Charleston. Go spend time with those students and ask yourself, are these kids being prepared for the world they'll be adults in or not? And the constant pressure of teachers and principals doing that great work is they're going to have fair, not great, but they're going to have okay test scores. And a lot of times parents in the community say, oh, the school's not that great, when it's actually doing incredible things.
So we asked about the legislators in the room. Raise your hand if you're from a higher education institution. Anybody? There are also quite a few of you. Hello. So getting back to this question about assessment and thinking about unlocking opportunities via assessment, what is the responsibility of higher education institutions in the room as they think about, as pre-K through 12 institutions think about preparing students for that college?
Yeah. So I want to give, it's an anecdote in my book, but this is worth sharing. So my team set me up for a day at a place, and I said, okay, I'm curious, I'd like to visit there, but this will be unbelievably traditional. And I'm going to see in detail how traditional it is, but I'm not going to see anything innovative. And I will say that in full disclosure, I'm embarrassed that that was my view going in. It was a stereotype. It was so wrong. It was a day at the U.S. Naval Academy. Okay, so I want you to think about the Naval Academy. Maybe you would think it'd be very traditional. So I go there, and Admiral Ted Carter, who's head, shares with me the following. He says, the first thing we realized, our admissions criteria were not letting us take the best possible future leadership for the Naval Academy. So we completely rethought admissions. We used to value SATs, grade point average, Eagle Scout, and letters from congressmen or senators. They said, that's not what we need to know. They look for tangible evidence that the applicant is the kind of person that just won't take no for an answer and persevering and make something positive happen that improves their world. And that, when I say it, is what you look for in a family member, it's what you look for in a neighbor, it's what you want, the people you want to work with. Not giving up to affect positive change on something you believe is important. They went on, they said, diversity, way up. Number of women, way up. Performance through the Naval Academy, far better. But the second thing they did, which is, I think, very important for higher ed, is they got rid of those bullshit introductory courses that largely weed people out and don't teach them anything. So they got rid of all their big lecture hall courses. And you go to the Naval Academy, and it's all Socratic seminar and project-based learning, and kids creating, midshipmen creating and implementing great projects to make their community better, the academy better, everything about their lives better. And you look at that, so the thing that's also interesting is most higher ed institutions, once somebody graduates, it's sort of goodbye, good luck, but please keep us in mind in your will. Keep donating, right? They don't live with the consequences, really, of their alums. The Naval Academy, that is the Navy, right? Yeah. They have more at risk and at stake in making sure they get it right than anybody else. And so I think higher ed institutions need to rethink admissions. I think they need to rethink what's going on. I mean, I run into places, I mean, back to some of the things that's just obsolete. And I promise you, go to the bank on this. I spent 4 years trying to find an adult who uses calculus in their daily lives. And some use the concepts marginally. Nobody does integrals and derivatives by hand in America professionally today. Yet we view that as the pinnacle of high school math. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. But you go to many colleges, and that is a weeder-outer, not only that keeps you from an engineering major, maybe if I really stretched, I could understand that. It keeps, I mean, most business programs don't let you go on in business to get a business degree without calculus. I say, I can't. You will not find anybody other than maybe a derivatives trader that ever deals with calculus. And so starting to rethink what actually leads to real learning. And I always encourage people to read the book Academically Adrift. You know, if you read Academically Adrift, they did longitudinal study on how much real learning goes on in college, and it's not a pretty picture. And so when you think about it, if somebody's just lecturing, so here we are lecturing at you, and I apologize because we had a morning of people lecturing at you, so we want to get, but when somebody just tells you something and you're taking notes and memorizing it and saying it back, I've yet to find people in my forums and discussions and things that say that's where real learning takes place. It takes place when you do things with it, when you create with it, when you teach others, when you are really pushed to ask thought-provoking questions. And I think you get that later in colleges, but I think a lot of times you have to kind of cross this desert called the introductory courses that largely weed people out. And one other thing, you've got community colleges represented. One of the most important strategic resources in our country today is our community colleges. And the more and the faster they can pivot to offering 1 to 3 month immersions, intangible skills that upgrade somebody's capability in the workplace, and get away from a 2-year wannabe of a 4-year degree, they will be playing that much more important role in making sure everybody can plug in and do well, even when the world changes according to that opening video.
So because we've been talking at you for a very long morning, do you mind if I give a quick pause to that really quickly? So I want to go on. Ted just mentioned briefly what he thinks about when he thinks about reimagining education, and I want to go into something that he calls the peak model. But before I do that, I want you all to take a minute and just close your eyes, if you feel comfortable doing that in this space, and imagine your favorite learning experience. It could have been in pre-K, it could have been in 12th grade, it could have been in college.
Could have been outside of school.
Could have been, that's right.
Oh, sorry.
Could have been totally outside of school, you're right. Raise your hand if you got it in your minds. Okay, turn to the person next to you and really quickly describe what that was. I'll give you about a minute. Go for it. Oh, sorry. You can talk to us if you want. I want to go into peak and just have them kind of compare in their heads, like how peak was compared to, because when I was reading peak, I was like, this is good teaching and learning, you know? And everyone has had that experience, but they haven't, like...
This is good that you're doing it.
It needs to be, you know, they need to see that, like, it's been possible, it is possible, it needs to be expanded to all classrooms, but... I just felt bad because I was like, we've been talking about that all morning.
Were you here all morning?
What was that?
Were you here all morning?
I was, yeah. Okay, go ahead and switch if you haven't yet.
Oh, I can get the peak. You want me to get the peak slide up?
Yeah, I noticed that you had a peak slide, and I was like, yes, we'll use that. Yeah. Okay, so we've talked a lot today already in this conversation about what we kind of, you know, this classroom with a regurgitation model and standardized tests. But when you think about that learning experience, shout out words that come to mind when you think about that best learning experience that you had. Hands-on. What else? Problem solving. What else? You're doing it. Yep. Physical. What else? Experiential or exploration? Relevance. Great. Fun. Why can't learning be fun, y'all? That's how we learn and remember things, right? Okay, so the reason I wanted you to think about that was because all of the things that you talked about are so core to a lot of the projects and programs that are inside of Ted's book that he describes, and kind of wrapped up in this really nice peak model that I wanted to make sure that you all saw. So as we're talking about instruction and learning inside of a classroom, or inside of any space, in or outside of school, Ted, can you talk a little bit about how you came to this and what each of these pillars mean?
Yeah, and so the book I profile, I had the luxury of having seen so many things as I traveled, and I picked out the things that I thought were the most kind of blow me away. The things I looked at and I said, kids doing this are going to be incredibly well prepared for a world defined by creativity and innovation. And by the way, I should say this, is when I picked those examples, I didn't have a type of school in mind. I visited all sorts of schools. I visited a lot of rural America, urban America, you name it, I was there. I picked the examples just because they were really impressive. Mm-hmm. And when the book came out, somebody sent our publisher a note saying, oh, this is probably another one of these well-off white guys saying that only charter schools can innovate. And I went back and I looked and I said, I don't think that's what these I don't think that's true. It was like it depends on how you count it, but I think it was like 35 great examples, 32 are in mainstream public schools. And so when people say public schools can't innovate, that is so wrong. There's so much innovation and pent-up innovation in our public schools, and they're doing it despite, I think, having more constraints placed on them. But I had all these examples. You can read them. It goes from kindergarten kids in Fort Wayne, Indiana, inventing robots and doing 3D printing to, I said last night, the kids in Dunbar doing the IT support staff, to kids in Fargo making documentaries about historic buildings in downtown, on and on, all these great examples. But as I tried to put together the book, there was kind of like, in some ways, at the surface, had no rhyme or reason. They were all really different. And I said, what are the common elements? And I came up with this acronym PEAK, which is the kids, when you talk to them, they were deeply mastering what they were doing. In those classrooms, the kids were required to create or do with it. All the answers you guys gave, create or do with it, teach other people it, demonstrate real mastery. The kids were acting with a large amount of agency. They were trusted to make choices in their own path. And I like to quote the senior person at Apple who recently said, we've decided that any employee who needs a boss is no longer employable. If you need a boss, you will not work here. What they want, what we all want, is somebody that can identify ways they can make that organization better and organize their own talents and the resources around them and get it done and check in with you responsibly every once in a while, but you don't want those go fetch a dog biscuit kids. The third thing is they're very clear about what they want kids to get good at. And they generally convene around, communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creative problem solving, citizenship. They're not saying cramming for a standardized bubble test. And then the final thing is, and this is really, really important, if somebody said back there, relevance and meaning. Yeah. When you go to the places where kids are on fire and where teachers really are so passionate about what they're doing, there's this deep sense of purpose in what's going on in those schools. And when I interviewed the students and say, why are you doing this? The answer was never because I want to get a good grade, or it was never because this will look good to a college admissions officer. Their answers were, I'm curious about this, so I'm learning more about it. We decided to invent this, so we're working together to do that. We have this initiative we want to do. They had something real, often connected to the world around them. And I always say, if school largely drives purpose out of kids for 12 to 16 years by saying, do something to police some 28-year-old anonymous college admissions officer, you can't fix that in a graduation speech. But if kids are going year in and year out, getting better and better at making their world better, doing exactly what the Naval Academy values, what we value, if they're building a body of work that shows they can create and follow through on initiatives to make their world better in a way they can define and defend, that builds real purpose in these kids. And so when you see that, it was sort of like, boom, watch for these things. We can all assess in a school we visit how much of this is there. But I want to share one other anecdote, because I do think we are way too confident that when kids work hard and get good grades that they've really learned. So knowledge. And I share this anecdote. There's a school in Princeton, New Jersey, Lawrenceville Academy. if you're on the Eastern Seaboard, particularly if you're well off and your kid gets into Lawrence Academy, you are doing cartwheels. Now, how much does it cost to send your kid to Lawrenceville? Boarding high school, $70,000 a year. So for $70,000 a year, your kid ought to be learning a lot, right? I mean, you should be asking for a refund if they aren't. And some educators at Lawrenceville became very concerned. They said, I'm not really sure our kids are learning. And so they came up with this idea. They proposed to the entire faculty, take the kids who took a final in June, and when they come back in September, give them the final again. And let's see how they do 3 months later. Because if they really learned it, they ought to do pretty much as well 3 months later. A bunch of the faculty got nervous and said, well, wait a minute. You know, like there were some things on the final that were low level they won't remember. Now, which begs the question, why would that be on a final, but fair be it? And so they said, fair enough, take off anything low level you think a student will forget. Retest them only on the essential concepts you're confident all of your students mastered. 3 months later, lots of kids, lots of subjects. Average grade went from a B+ to an F. And not one kid retained all the concepts the faculty thought every kid had retained. Wow. And so what they realized is when you skim through content lightly, and we go after AP US History, 1491 to present day in a school year. 20 minutes on the Constitution, 2 days on the Vietnam War, 2 days on World War II. Go to the bookstore, you'll see AP US History flashcards to prepare for that exam. That's not teaching kids history. That's skimming over content and feeling some sense of confidence. Think Gordon Gee said last night, complacency, since they covered it, they clearly retain it, but they don't.
The difference between teaching and learning.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go on to the last couple of questions that I have. I want to make it known that we're going to have some time for question and answer, and hopefully this sparked some things in you. And you're done with lunch. It's perfect timing. So start to think of those questions and get ready, and then in about 10 minutes, we'll have some of you come up for questions, hopefully.
Or we'll call on you. We're good at that.
I was just going to say, if there's nobody that comes up like the last couple times, I was a former teacher.
You are looking out for it.
Okay, so this is a Legislators Forum, and you know, I'm gonna again pull a quote from your book that I thought was really interesting, and try to gear back towards policy. So put an excellent leader in a school, and its teaching force soon follows, whether the school is public, private, or charter. The inverse is just as true. Yet for 2 decades, our education debate about tenure, charter, and vouchers has drawn our attention from the first order issue of reimagining school. So if legislators in the room were to draw their attention back to that first order issue of reimagining school, I know many of them are already there. What would you hope that they'd be really thinking about from a legislature and policy perspective?
Yeah, I mean, first, I'm deeply grateful for those serving in the legislature. I mean, I write about how difficult and demanding a set of responsibilities it is. You know, the thing I'd say is that, and I'll tell a story of myself. You know, if you backed up the clock 15 years ago and asked me, are you an expert on education? I would say yes. And you'd say, why? And I'd say, well, I went to school. And what more do I need? And if you'd asked me 15 years ago, what should we be doing in school? I would say it's very easy. You know, better test scores, more rigorous college-ready content, more kids out of high school into colleges. We can just do those 3 things well. We will be doing much better internationally, blah, blah, blah. We will solve it. Now that I still don't call myself an expert on education, but I know a lot more than I did 15 years ago. And I actually think those 3 priorities do enormous amounts of damage. You know, the test scores tell us very little about what's important, and they drive the real learning out of the schools. The rigorous college-ready content, as I said before, very little of it actually gets used later in life. And on the college front, and this sort of piggybacks somewhat on the last panel, but when we come to 4-year colleges, I want you to keep in mind the rule of 5, okay? Every 100 kids in 8th grade in the United States, here's what happens. 20 end up dropping out of high school, by and large because they find it boring. Not they can't do it, not because they don't have great talents, but school doesn't work for them. And in America today, a high school dropout is in a world of hurt. 20 stop at the end of high school. They don't necessarily have to be in a world of hurt, but if they're in a college-only or college-ready focused curriculum, I call it, you end up high school with 2 choices, right? More education, more formal, costly education, or Chipotle. a minimum wage crappy job where you're working 30 hours a week. Because we don't, in very few situations in K through 12, teach kids distinctive proficiencies that open up career doors for them, and we could. That's another 20. 20 go to some college and drop out, often with student loan debt. Tell me what a dropout of an anonymous college with 30K of student loan debt, what their life looks like. They're punished. So now you have 40 that finish college. But out of those 40, 20 end up working at a Starbucks type job, even though they have a college degree, and many of those are carrying student loan debt. So out of the 100, only 20 hit the promised land of the job we think of as every college grad getting, and many of those have a job they don't like. And many of them have student loan debt they can't repay. And it works together, right? Because the higher your student loan debt, the more you've got to take a job you're not really that excited about just to be able to cover your loan payments. So I'm really skeptical that that model's working really for anyone. And one of the questions it begs, right, is in a world where it's easier and easier to learn on our own, why do we insist on more and more years of costly formal education? Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't we triumph and celebrate kids that can learn on their own, find their mission in life, and say, I can figure it out going forward with or without more formal, costly education? And so one of my, they mentioned the intro, but I had it out multiple times with Obama, who kept saying how everybody in the 20th century needs a college degree, but they also need a master's degree, they probably need a PhD. More and more years of formal, costly instruction without anybody stepping back to saying, what are we going to do to make sure when kids are learning in education circumstances, they're actually really learning? So legislators, I think you have an enormous opportunity here. And as I say, you're responsible to taxpayers. You need to make sure that those tax dollars are being well spent. I understand all that. But as I say, I'm begging several of you to take those standards that you're holding your schools accountable to and reflect on whether this is really the right accountability framework, whether a kid pushed to get good at these questions is actually going to be in a position to do well later in life, and to start supporting things, like the best of all investments in any state, and you're making great progress here, it's really inspiring, but the best possible investment for a state's future, for its economy, for its citizens, is making sure the investment dollars are there for school. And I don't think, by the way, and this, I'm going to go on a little and then we get to questions, but I'm not one of the people that says college should be free. And I'm definitely not one of the people that says we should have a blanket forgiveness of student loan debt, because for every person who borrowed $150K to go to college, there are a bunch of other people who work 3 jobs. There's some really tricky issues around the cost of college. What I am for is better, more affordable education. And because if something's free, people don't value it. And the last time I checked, there are very few states rolling in tons of resources so that if state colleges have no tuition, they can make the education even better. The hidden factor here, right, it breaks my heart to go to even our most prestigious colleges and see kids working in the fast food restaurant to try to cover some of their cost. And I talk about kids in Vermont, art kids who normally aren't going to graduate from high school, where in Vermont, their state legislature let kids swap out obsolete requirements like algebra for something more meaningful. And so I write about a young woman who loves art, who is on a path not to graduate from high school with no practical skills. She's in big trouble. She comes up with the idea, pitches her school on replacing algebra with website design. It says, you don't have to teach me, I'll learn it on my own, but would you let this count as an equivalent to algebra? Now you think about a gifted art kid who knows how to design websites. We're talking $20 to $30 an hour minimum. Mm-hmm. I talk about kids in Albuquerque, New Mexico, who, again, we're not going to graduate from high school. Many kids don't graduate because of the math requirement. And, I'm a math guy, but, how many of you are doing 1/6 to the p power, And they let these kids, they went out and met with real organizations in your community and said, do you have problems high school kids could help with? When I say that, I don't blame you for saying what adult organization has a real problem that high school kids could actually help with. This has to be make work, right? Adult organizations do not have problems high school kids could help with. Stay with me. They call on the Albuquerque Soul. It's a soccer team in Albuquerque. It's run by people my age. They say, there's this stuff out there we've heard of we don't know anything about, but do you think social media could help us grow our fan base, help us attract younger fans? Do you happen to have any 15-year-old Hispanic kids that would like to design and implement social media campaigns for us? Social media requires applied math, language arts, and aesthetics. Mm-hmm. The spot rate, if you're good at social media campaigns, is at least $30 an hour. Every organization in Albuquerque, even globally, because you can market those services online, is desperate for help with social media. And the point I make in my book is, out of 200 schools, the only school I went to in the country that gave kids a chance to get good at social media campaigns was Siembra Leadership Academy in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if we rely on the College Board and the US Department of Education to somehow bring social media skills into our schools, use them productively and constructively, it will be 2030 and it will be about MySpace and Friendster. And so the ability, you know, and I really want to emphasize this, these kids in Dunbar could work in the summer as 10 and 11-year-olds on the IT support desk. It is very possible for your kids to get really good at something that lets them have a job that's 3x the minimum wage, that lets them create clusters of excellence in their town in West Virginia and market their services, not just throughout the state, but throughout the globe. And doesn't mean you throw everything in the current curriculum aside. You have to back off. I mean, I had a meeting a month ago with the CEO of Squarespace, website design, leading firm. I said, how many high school kids design great websites? He said, lots. I said, how long does it take them to get good at it? He says, oh, a few weeks. I said, how many schools encourage kids to get good at website design? 0. And you have to ask yourself, why? These are the biggest of missed opportunities. But you don't have to miss them. You know, other places will. But I'm here because I'm hoping you guys don't.
One more question before we move into those questions, and it can be quick, but being from a regional network that encompasses Southwest Pennsylvania and West Virginia, your last chapter is It Takes a Village, and obviously I'm a really big proponent. My career is really in network leadership, and so thinking about the enormity of the change that needs to happen and how it's going to take legislators, it's going to take higher education, it's going to take schools and out-of-school organizations and businesses and government, everyone to come together to make this change. Thinking about that and thinking about West Virginia, which is a state of 1.8 million people, as Dr. Gee was saying yesterday. He was saying that, you know, West Virginia has all the opportunity in the world, and you were talking about it as a small and agile state. So as you think about all that you've learned about West Virginia and you think about this grassroots collective effort towards the future of learning, what is the potential you see for the state?
You know, I want to make this point as emphatically as I can. You know, one of the things I love about our country, America is a country where people respond to big challenges. And I may look at today that I was alive during World War II, but I actually wasn't. But my parents were. And I love reading the history of World War II and what happened after. And you look at how much this country did when people worked together to take on this aspirational goal of saving the free world, of rebuilding our country, of helping rebuild Europe. America loves a challenge. Then I ask you, when's the last time you were issued a collective challenge with an aspirational goal? When did somebody say to you, work with your neighbors, your community members, to do something really important collectively? I mean, you know, like after 9/11, what do we hear? Go shopping, right? Nobody issues that kind of challenge. And if we wait for it to come from Washington, D.C., good luck. It is not going to come from Washington, D.C. But what I love about Remake Learning, what I love about what they're doing across Pittsburgh and northern West Virginia, what West Virginia could do across this state, I am totally confident that if you put out an aspirational challenge, what can we do as adults to give our kids every opportunity to lead lives that will be fulfilling, purposeful, that will let them find their gifts and make their world better? And there are ways each of us can plug in and make that happen. You can do that. And it doesn't mean we need to recruit several hundred people from, the people in this room could do that. I mean, we can do that. And what fight is better to fight than to actually go out and say, damn it all, we are going to actually rethink what we're doing with our kids in school, and we are going to make it happen. And we're going to do it in a way that 5 years from now, people from Massachusetts, people from California, people from Finland are going to come to West Virginia and say, how the hell did you do it? Because what you did is nothing less than amazing.